Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. The muted complexes and concrete towers that paint the image of America's public housing tell a deep story. It's a story of segregation, of communities trying to survive along the margins, and of money and power shaping neighborhoods. In Detroit, as in many places, it's a layered story, one that involves neighborhoods like Black Bottom. The historically Black community was raised in the name of renewal. Many displaced residents were promised better housing in public projects, but those promises rarely came to fruition. Even in the most challenging times, many public housing residents have held things together, raising children, organizing neighbors, demanding more. Now, a new museum in Chicago illuminates those histories, not to romanticize them, but to confront them. The National Public Housing Museum honors the people who made homes in a system stacked against them. It also asks, what should public housing in America look like today? How can it be a place where people can really thrive? To answer these questions, Lisa Yun Lee joins us now. She's the executive director and chief curator at the National Public Housing Museum. Lisa, welcome to the program.
Hi, Robin. I'm so excited to be here. What's up, Detroit?
We're so excited to have you. Lisa, public housing in America is often framed as a failed experiment. Could we start by having you briefly tell us an untold story of resilience, community, or activism that mainstream narratives have overlooked?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. And you are absolutely right. When you say the phrase public housing, just the words often conjure feelings and thoughts in the popular imagination. And it's usually not of vibrant communities that live there, nor the people who formed imaginative and complex networks of support and friendships, but of stereotypes of what it means to be poor and too often Black in America. But when you start to listen to the stories of the people who live there, really listen, you start to hear the stories of candy ladies, of barber shops, of amazing activism. And maybe I'll just sort of start there. There's been a lot of scholarship recently around this and a lot of storytelling about, for example, amazing Black women activists in leadership that have emerged from public housing that have so much to tell us about tenant rights and about empowerment and about resistance. And Detroit is one of those places where you have like the history of short end of the stick and people fighting evictions, and all of these stories are really important for us to listen to as we move forward.
So public housing has historically been a hub of activism. I want to talk about the first public housing projects, Lisa, because they were built for white families, while Black Americans were often relegated to segregated or inferior units. And in Detroit, the Sojourner Truth Housing Project became a national controversy in 1942. That was when white residents violently protested Black families moving into federally funded housing, even though it was built specifically for them. How did moments like that and the policies surrounding them reveal how deeply racism was baked into the foundation of public housing in this country?
Yeah, thanks for that framing. And it really is impossible to understand public housing today or ask questions about its future without really dwelling into the history of white supremacy and systemic racism in America. When you there's a kind of prevailing ahistorical narrative that public housing is just a failed social policy. But even just a brief history reveals that initially, when it was started with the National Housing Act of 1937, it was meant to build subsidized housing for millions of working class Americans who were devastated by the Great Depression. And at one point, the US government's mandate was to provide, I'm just going to quote from the Housing Act, a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family. Now, we know that a lot of America's greatest ambitions are sort of layered and baked in with a lot of history of racism, and public housing is no different in that way. There was a lot of systemic racism and economic injustice that informed failed public housing policies, and that included, the history of redlining, of intentional segregation, of public housing projects that were built exclusively for Black families, public housing which really only allowed white families in them. And then, of course, as we continue on, and this history of racism includes police acting with impunity and not creating any safety at all for the residents who live there, chronic disinvestment, and crumbling unsafe buildings due to deferred maintenance. And unless you start to really ask critical questions about these systems, then you can't really understand at all sort of what happened to public housing, why it was both a failure in many ways and also success for many people.
And when you talk about police acting with impunity, I'm guessing you're also referring to the fact that a lot of these areas have been historically over-policed.
Yeah, public housing residents have been faced with some of the highest degrees of scrutiny and police surveillance, while at the same time being nearly invisible and marginalized and pushed to, sort of being ignored by sort of other mainstream systems like of education and public health and other things. And so the kind of over-policing and the high level of surveillance did not lead to any kind of real safety for the residents.
When we're thinking about discrimination in housing, it makes me think of the term urban renewal and how it relates to public housing. First, Lisa, very briefly, can you explain what that term was supposed to mean?
Right. Well, I mean, it depends on who you ask, right? Because there's some, very famous sort of quotes about urban renewal really being Negro removal. And, of course, I'm quoting Baldwin here, but, urban renewal in its, I guess, most aspirational and highest sort of intention was to look at blighted areas of cities and to reinvest money into them and to address sort of bad housing, create new pathways for businesses and for travel and public transportation and education and things like that. But just a very quick, you don't have to even helicopter up too much to sort of see that urban renewal too often in American cities has really meant sort of the building of highways and investments meant to segregate cities. It's been a really powerful force in displacing people from their homes under the pretense of saying that we want to, demolish projects to actually build safer housing, but the sort of financial arrangements that are used to do it don't actually replace these housing complexes with enough affordable housing, but instead replace it with housing which is out of the reach of people. And so, I mean, honestly, I just have to say that there's been very few urban renewal movements in the United States where brown and Black people have ended up really gaining and benefiting. They've really been state-sanctioned policies and investments in segregation and really advancing displacement.
So, Lisa, then, in other words, the government used programs framed as urban renewal to weaponize housing policy against communities of color under the illusion of progress.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's just really saying it plainly. Now, that's not to say that the people who were committed to urban renewal, were intentionally sitting in the back room, sort of like scheming. I mean,
Sure.
that's why it's important to have a systemic analysis of how white supremacy and racism works, right? Because there are really amazing urban planners, policymakers, and people who really were trying to fix American cities. And Detroit was also one of those places where people looked at crumbling buildings, looked at segregation, said, hey, we have to do something about it. And, maybe I'll just sort of name, the most important one in America, resulting out of the Kerner Commission, from the moment of the 1967 riots that happened in Detroit, in New York, and elsewhere, that really said, like, hey, we have to understand the violence in American cities. And the only way that we can understand it is by addressing the history of racism. And we need to actually address the issues of things like housing in order to do that. And from that, urban renewal policies came forth. But, they were well intentioned, but because they didn't have the addressing of the root causes of poverty and violence, which is racism, then they were all kind of destined to fail.
Lisa, let's zoom in, if we could, on Detroit. I want to look at the Brewster Douglass projects, which were a storied place. Families raised generations there. Children played in hallways that echoed with Motown music and dreams. Diana Ross grew up there. So did teachers, auto workers, poets, preachers. And yet, those towers were eventually left to rot and then erased from the skyline. What does the demolition of such a place, full of life, memory, meaning, reveal about this country's broader treatment of public housing and the people who call it home?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for mentioning Brewster Douglass, of course, legendary public housing project, kind of like Cabrini Green or Robert Taylor homes, just really iconic space and place in American history. And maybe I want to, before I talk about the demolition, I just want to say in the National Public Housing Museum, we have a beautiful room that's curated by DJ Spinderella from the legendary Salt and Peppa, who grew up in the Pink Houses. And it looks at the history of musicians who grew up in public housing. And we worked with people like Dr. Josh Kuhn, the author of Audiotopia, and a MacArthur Genius Fellow also, who really is trying to understand the song track of America and how it isn't just a sort of single, voice, but actually a chorus of many voices folded into one, of people who have come from endlessly hybrid and heterogeneous and, enriching sort of backgrounds. And, of course, Brewster Douglass is one of these places because of its proximity to also Motown music, and Brewster Douglass became a kind of training ground for Motown sound and contributing to its unique and influential style. When we listen to the public housing oral histories that we've recorded of residents, they tell stories of how people living in public housing like Brewster Douglass, they lived in such close proximity to people. Their daily lives were just filled with so many different sounds, whether it was klezmer to jazz to blues to all sorts of different music, and church music and street corners, and this kind of close proximity to many different sounds led to what we really understand as the beautifully diverse soundtrack of America. And so Brewster Douglass is like a kind of place like that. And so when you come and visit the museum, there's like a whole section of Detroit music with, not just the Supremes, but gospel singer Edeline DeBarge, Mary Wilson, and other people. So I just want everybody to come to Chicago and visit this rec room.
For that Detroit love.
Exactly. But, it's not just that. It's also that when you look at the history of Brewster Douglass, you also understand other large movements in U.S. history which contributed to housing injustice, which led to the demolition of public housing complexes. So, for example, one could start with sort of post-war booms where public housing was filled with GIs who came back from the war. And one of the things is those GIs then were often offered a GI Bill opportunity for education and for housing mortgages. But it was just the white GIs who actually were offered those mortgages. And so that led then to white GIs moving out of public housing, and then Black families staying in public housing. The other thing that happens is there's an increase of redlining and restrictive racial covenants and other really sort of legal systems that enforced segregation and stopped Black families from buying homes in certain areas of the city, which then also led to further segregation, the inability of Black families to generate generational wealth, and sort of white flight from urban areas into suburban sort of rings, which Detroit, like Paris, like many cities, suffers from this
Right.
ring environment.
Lisa, we're running out of
Oh,
time
sorry.
here. No worries. I want to speed up to the present if we could, and to the future, actually. So as briefly as you can, many Americans think that public housing is free or it's a handout, but we know tenants, they pay rent, often in conditions that are crumbling. What are the realities that public housing residents face today, from safety to stigma?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there's really not a single county in the US where a full-time worker can afford a modest two-bedroom apartment. And that if you look at the homelessness rate in cities, also like Detroit, or you look at sort of new migrants coming in, there's just a woeful lack of affordable housing. And so the government's responsibility to provide housing for its people and for us to think about housing as a human right is really, really critical. And that means that we can't just focus on home ownership, but understand that public housing residents, as well as people who are renting, are really important denizens who are keeping our cities safe and flourishing. And so there's not like a stigma to not owning a home. Also, the fact is you're making a home in these spaces. And like you said, you're paying rent, but there needs to be, additional line items in cities' budgets to actually pay for fixing buildings and maintaining it, just as there are dedicated line items for fixing, prominent, beautiful buildings and high rises where rich people live.
And Lisa, the U.S. doesn't have to reinvent the wheel necessarily. I'm thinking about in countries like Austria and Singapore, where public housing is considered a cornerstone of society, not a last resort. Can you speak at all to what they're doing right and what the U.S. can learn from those models?
Hello?
Can you hear me? Lisa?
Oh, sorry. We sort of bugged out. I'm sorry about that.
No worries. So before we go, I'm wondering if you can speak at all to what's happening in countries like, say, Austria and Singapore. Those are places where public housing is considered a cornerstone of society. They're not looked at as a last resort. Can you speak to what they're doing right and what the U.S. can learn from those countries?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. One is to not tie housing to like a job or any kind of restrictive evaluation. So at different times in U.S. history, people have kind of required people to like actually have a job to live in housing or to not be someone who was formerly incarcerated. We really have to make sure that housing is a human right. And like the United States is one of the few countries that actually doesn't guarantee housing as a human right. So that's one thing. The other thing is to see preservation practices as really critical and not just be committed to sort of knocking down every single old building and building new buildings. And I think Detroit has a remarkable opportunity because of its commitment to preservation and its beautiful stock of buildings that could be used for housing and really investing in the new generation of architects. Other cities across the globe don't have single family houses, so the zoning is really important. Like people are committed to living together and living in community. And so I think for us and for the future of Detroit to make sure that the zoning, really encourages multifamily homes and multi spaces, complexes, which is also really, really important work. I think there are a lot of places to look, and also the history of Detroit, there are places to also look within our own histories of when we got it right and it wasn't always, sort of a failure, and that there are really stories from residents that we can learn from for our future.
Lisa Yun Lee is the executive director and chief curator at the National Public Housing Museum. It opened to the public last month in Chicago. Lisa, thanks for joining us today on the Metro.
Thanks, Robin.
Tomorrow on the program, we'll hear from a man who grew up in public housing in Detroit and how it shaped his life. Coming up, the state of Michigan is finally taking some action on the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people. But is it enough to address the thousands of open cases in the state? We'll speak with a tribal leader next. This is the Metro on WDET. Stay with us.